Well, good morning, lucky me. Good morning. I get to go first, which I've decided means if I'm rubbish, you'll all have forgotten by the end of the day, so it's fine. I'm going to be speaking this morning about the Battle of Pinkie, which took place just near here on the 9th and 10th of September in 1547, and about which I've co-authored a book with David Caldwell and Bess Rhodes. I've said to Bess she's here, so if I can't answer anything, she can. Specifically, I'm going to focus on what the archaeology has or hasn't been able to tell us to date, and what it might be able to tell us going forward. My first introduction to Pinkie was way back in 2007, when AOC was asked to undertake a study to determine whether the little cross swords marking the location of the battle on the Ordnance Survey maps was really accurate. That is, what was the evidence that the cross swords marked the actual location that the Scottish and English armies clashed? That site was Gula Flats, where you can see the little cross swords between Wallingford and the A1. In that first investigation, we used just about every archaeological technique you can think of to get a better understanding of the site and its relationship to the battle. We metal detected, we did geophysical survey, dug test pits and trial trenches. Thanks, Rob Ingle, wherever you are. And this was all backed up with detailed historical research and landscape studies. Now, I've revisited Gula Flats many times over the years, but in addition to work there, I've also managed or reviewed work on sites at Wallingford Expansion, Barback Law, Dolphingston, New Craig Hall, Crookston and Whitecraig. All of this work eventually led to collaboration with David Caldwell from about 2014, and David brought in Bess, a historian from St Andrews University, and this all culminated in 2023 with the publication of a book re-examining what we thought we knew about Pinkie. Now, back in 2007, there was no inventory of historic battlefields, and in fact, beyond a paper published by David in 1991 in a book called Scotland at War, there had been very little consideration of Pinkie since the discovery of the Battle of Pinkie Roll in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. Sir Charles Oman, an influential military historian, had identified the roll as a contemporary depiction of the events of the Battle of Pinkie. He wrote two papers about it in 1933 and 1937, which heavily drew on the depictions in the roll. And for a long time, that was that. There was very little written about it between that and David's paper. But in the mid-2000s, not just me, but a number of other people and organisations began to take notice of Pinkie again. Historic Scotland, as they were then, were of course developing the Inventory of Historic Battlefields, which was eventually published in 2011. And the Battlefield Trust produced their summary of the Battle of Pinkie, along with many other battles across Scotland and England. And East Lothian Council archaeology officers started to think, hey, what's the archaeological potential of this battlefield? So today, we have many academics, researchers, national and local government agencies, and local people looking to understand and commemorate the Battle of Pinkie in a variety of ways. With all of this renewed interest, it seemed the right time to re-examine the primary and secondary sources describing the battle and to try to integrate that with landscape studies and the results of the fairly extensive archaeological investigations that had taken place throughout the battlefield since the mid-2000s. And it was with that in mind that David, Bess and I set out to write our book. The book is a re-examination of historical sources and the integration of this with the results of archaeological investigations, from which we hope to gain a fuller understanding of the battle, both in terms of the event itself and in terms of the repercussions afterwards. Now, at the risk of giving away a spoiler and doing ourselves out of some book sales, one of the conclusions was that we do in fact see the battle and its aftermath largely through the eyes of the commanders or their representatives. And the stories we know have come down via those who had time to write about the battle and who have been considered sufficiently important to have their writings preserved. But there is less known, for example, about the experience of the common soldier, about their families, and about how the battle would have affected local residents. Historical research undertaken for the book has drawn out some small snippets which indicate what it must have been like for these people. David found government records relating to the lands at Elphinston. The battle had ruined their crops, or they had been taken away to feed the armies, and so the holders of Elphinston couldn't pay their tithes. Bess found records of the Earl of Arran, commander of the Scottish army, on an outing shortly after the battle, and he had to seek refuge in St Giles Cathedral because the wives of Edinburgh were likely to stone him to death because they'd lost their husbands. There's also a record of Erin in November 1547 giving alms to a poor man who had his arm struck off at Pinkie. While these snippets appear in the archival records, they to date remain few and far between and are still often reported from the perspective of the ruling class. This is where archaeology maybe can make a difference, and if we can just find the right locations to look, maybe give us a broader picture of the impact of the Battle of Pinkie on the local landscape and the people that lived within it. But before we can start to think about where to look in the future, probably best to discuss the archaeological remains that have been discovered at Pinkie to date. This includes historical finds, which have for many, many years been attributed to the battle, as well as artifacts that have been recovered in more recent and ongoing archaeological investigations. So when I first began my research into Pinkie in 2007, the first place I went looking was PassMap. And what I found on PassMap back in 2007 was a record of a point that had been assigned for the battle, marked with that little black marker there. Back in 2007, the information associated with the point simply gave the dates of the battle. It noted the site was included in the Battlefields Trust's study, and it noted, and this is a bit about the archaeological finds, that the Ordnance Survey name book recorded quantities of human bone, pieces of spear, horseshoes, officers' epaulets, all of which it recorded as having been recovered from the area indicated. So from that location showed on the map. Today, this entry incorporates significantly more information, summarising the results of the fieldwork that has been undertaken since 2007. However, it still retains reference to the finds noted in the Ordnance Survey name book. Similar to the PassMap entry, the Battlefield Trust entry for Pinkie in 2005 listed these finds and specifically assigned them to a location east of the Howe Mire. And Historic Scotland inventory followed on from this, though, because what I'm about to tell you, that's now been corrected. However, this data point appeared to have been placed near or on, depending on which OS map you're looking at, those modern Ordnance Survey cross swords, marking the location of the battle. But as far as I can tell, there isn't much more justification for the artifacts being ascribed this location. There are a couple of problems with this. And here, you'll forgive me a little aside, those pesky cross swords, which we tend to think mark the centre of a battlefield, have been migrating across the landscape for a couple hundred years. As far as I can tell, the first depiction of the cross sword is on Kirkwood's map of 1817, which you can see there. He placed the cross swords more centrally in the fields of Inveresk and to the southeast of Pinkie Burn House. Two maps from 1834 place the cross swords to the northwest of Pinkie Burn House, closer to Inveresk village. And the first annotation of the battlefield on the Ordnance Survey doesn't mark crosswords at all, but annotates the site of the Battle of Pinkie 1547 across a wider area over the whole of Inveresk fields. And it's only on later Ordnance Survey maps that we get the current marking of the crosswords to the south of Walliford at Gula Flats. The other issue in quoting this location for the recovery of the finds is that no one seemed to have gone back to the OS name book as the source material. Having re-examined the name book, along with the statistical account for Scotland, I then went back to the early Ordnance Survey mapping and discovered a few things. The Ordnance Survey name book for the Battle of Pinkie describes a much wider area and indicates that the finds recovered did not come from the point of the modern cross swords. The entry in the name book states, "The Battle of Pinkie encompassed a large extent of ground, ranging from near the foot of the Pinkies to the farms of Fawside and Carberry by Howe Mire. Here the Scots came in close contact with the English. The battle now commenced and raged with the greatest of fury, extending through the lands of Walliford and Barbaclaw, and until at last the Scots were forced to fly, some towards Edinburgh and others in the direction of Dalkeith. From time to time, large quantities of human bone have been found in the tract of land described. And some are at present finding in a quarry at the foot of Pinkie Brae. Also pieces of spears, swords, horseshoes, and officers' epaulets have been found in a flat piece of land, then a moss, immediately south of Pinkie Burn House." So, the finds referenced in PassMap and later the battlefield infantry of coming from the east side of Howe Mire are clearly stated as coming from a mossy area immediately south of Pinkie Burn House. While this largely corresponds with the area now known as the Howe Mire, the description of proximity to Pinkie Burn House suggests that these were recovered from the northwestern corner of the mire and not from the eastern edge, as had previously been suggested. The entry in the name book for Haumire itself makes no mention of the battle or these finds. Further, if the epaulets have been correctly identified, these date from the 18th century at the earliest. In addition, the human remains are noted as coming from the area of the battlefield described by the Ordnance Survey more generally, and not specifically from the location south of Pinkieburn House, from which the other historical finds have been recovered, and more specifically noted as coming from Pinkie Brae. The entry for Pinkie Brae notes that human remains had been dug up along the top of the brae from time to time, and the surveyor completing the entry in the name book noted that he himself had observed upwards of 20 coffins being recovered from the quarry at the northeast end of the brae. The first edition Ordnance Survey map indicates that this quarry was in the vicinity of Leven Hall. The bodies recovered from Pinkie Brae and Leven Hall quarry are described by the Ordnance Survey book as including coffins, while the new statistical account noted in particular they were recovered from stone coffins. Stone coffins clearly indicate that these bodies were of a significantly earlier period, probably representing late prehistoric or early historic longkists. It's also worth noting that bodies relating to the battle probably wouldn't have been buried in coffins, given that the English just returned the next day and quickly buried their dead before moving on to Leith. So, unfortunately, we can't rely on historical artifacts previously attributed to the battle to tell us much about it. Not only does it appear that the location originally given to these finds and human remains on the past map was incorrect, it also seems unlikely that many of the remains are related to the battle. Insofar as the remains can be dated based on the written descriptions of them, they appear to be associated with earlier or later periods. Now, as I mentioned, since the mid-2000s, the potential for encountering battle-related remains in an area between the River Esk and Wallingford has been more widely recognised, and quite a large amount of archaeological fieldwork has taken place within the battlefield. Archaeological investigations at a number of greenfield sites proposed for future development within the battlefield have been subject to archaeologically rigorous metal detecting surveys. Many areas subject to investigation are indicated here. A few of these areas have had the Battle of Pinkie at the heart of the research questions posed to inform the fieldwork. These are primarily Barbacklaw, Wallingford Expansion, Gula Flats, Victory Lane, Crookston, Pinkie Mains, Dolphinston and Goshen, and they're the ones highlighted red. In addition to those areas, human remains were discovered just beyond the battlefield inventory boundary during the construction of this very university. That's Area 1 on the slide there. The remains were reportedly found by a member of the public during construction, and the pit which they'd come from was later identified by archaeologists. Dating of the remains indicated that they were broadly of 16th century date and thus could be contemporary with the battle and potentially relate to the rout of the Scottish army after the battle. Bullets, musket balls, lead shot, all frequent finds throughout East Lothian, and there has been a tendency where they've been recovered from within the battlefield for researchers to suggest they may be associated with the Battle of Pinkie. However, such items are very hard to date with any accuracy. Round shot recovered from the battle is slightly more convincing in terms of Pinkie, as it refers to larger munitions, which would have been fired from artillery, potentially like that used at Pinkie. Whilst it may be tempting to assign such finds to the battle, we have to be cautious, particularly given the location of the Napoleonic barracks, which housed the 42nd Foot in the area. It seems possible, if not probable, that many of the military artifacts recovered from the area, including small arms bullets, relate to training activities associated with the barracks. If the finds could be dated to the 16th century, it may be equally possible that the shot related to the English incursion into Scotland in 1544. Only composite shot, that is, shot comprised of an iron cube surrounded by lead, can specifically be said to date to the 16th century, and thus could be broadly contemporary with the Battle of Pinkie. This plan shows the location of archaeologically recovered round shot, including composite shot, from within the battlefield. As you can see, only 4 definite composite shot have been recovered, with a further 3 possible composite shot. As such, it's not really possible to accurately define the extent or character of the action which took place during the battle based solely on munition finds alone. Now, back to that one. While areas such as Gula Flats, which is Area 3 on the slide, you can see it, and Wallingford Expansion have been subject to detailed surveys, No baseline had been established for the wider battlefield prior to their surveys, and a lack of comparable assemblages of artefacts recovered from the battle sites contemporary with the Battle of Pinkie, and a lack of consistency in methodology for the recovery and recording of finds prior to 2015 have also prevented secure interpretation of the extent of the battlefield or movement across it, based on finds alone. Given the limitations posed in interpreting the battle from munitions alone, consideration has been given to the recovery of other possible battle-related finds. Land at Crookston, down here at the south of the A1, has now been subject to 3 metal detecting surveys since September 2016. A total of 19 hectares have been surveyed, including a 13-hectare field surrounding Crookston and a further 6-hectare field to the west. The larger field was initially surveyed by experienced amateur metal detectorists, with the rest being surveyed by AOC, and AOC surveyed the 19-hectare field a second time. Finds recovered from Crookston included 25 pieces of lead shot, a possible sword pommel, and several mounts, including 2 which feature Tudor rose decorations, and another in the form of an imperial crown. A scabbard mount, strap mount, horse harness mount, and crowned flower badge may also be contemporary with the battle. These finds may be particularly important in understanding the battle, as they represent non-munition finds which may be related to it. Now, I know you'll be thinking, hang on a minute, Vicky, you're going to tell us all the great things that archaeology could maybe tell us about the battle, but what I've just told you is that the historical finds probably don't relate to it, and despite all of this effort put into archaeological investigation in the past 15 to 20 years, all we've really got to show for it is a handful of round shot, a few horse badges and mounts, and a burial, which may or may not be related to the battle. And it's true, there have been limitations in our archaeological assessment of the battlefield so far. These in part relate to the methodologies employed, and in part from the Pinkie battlefield itself. Firstly, battlefield archaeology is, relatively speaking, a fairly recent subdiscipline of archaeology. It largely became popular in the United States at sites like the Battle of the Little Bighorn, where there was an extraordinarily rich archaeological remains which actually allowed the course of the battle to be mapped across the landscape. And subsequently, the method of recovery in the UK has sort of followed that US model. However, many battlefields studied in the States, as one would expect, are much later than Pinkie. And at places like the Little Bighorn, the battles were fought on open land, which was then never developed. At Pinkie, the landscape was already being intensely used at the time of the battle, particularly with regard to agriculture and mining, and that's carried on in uses up to the modern day. There's also been significant earth moving that's taken place in the Pinkie battlefield in the late post-medieval and modern periods. There's been significant agricultural improvements, the insertion of the East Coast Main Line and the A1, and this is a picture of when they were building the A1 across the Esk. There are the Bings at Carbery and Walliford, and of course the significant residential developments at Musselburgh, Walliford and Pinkie. And as such, we just have to accept that some archaeological evidence related to the battle will have been lost, and that which survives might not be in its original location. We have to consider that traditional battlefield archaeology techniques might not work at Pinkie. But if we stop focusing on the recovery of lead, and specifically artillery shot, and focus our efforts elsewhere, we might be more successful. The finds recovered from Crookston show that other metal finds dating from the battle may be present and have a story to tell. And whilst I haven't gone into the account here, the great chronicler of Pinkie, William Patten, has informed us of several features and actions that might be recoverable archaeologically. These include a turf-banked enclosure, just down there at the bottom, which stopped the English vanguard from arraying properly on the side of Fawside Hill, and a cross-ditch or slough, which stood between the Scots and the charging English cavalry. Patten also reports the burning of Fawside Castle, and presumably the 10 houses round about it, as well as the report that the English returned the day after the battle to bury their dead. The identification of the turf bank enclosure, or slough, would help in locating the centre of the battle, and thus likely lead to the recovery of greater densities of artefacts than have been recovered thus far. It goes without saying that the recovery of the English burials could also yield significant information and understanding about those who fought and died. And the identification and excavation of the houses at Fawside, if they survive below the ground surface, would further our understanding of the local residents and perhaps the tragic impact the battle had upon them. The use of landscape archaeology to better understand the 16th century landscape could help identify these features that we know affected the course of the battle. More intensive study, including, for example, survey and excavation around Colton Dean, where our book proposes the cross-stitch likely was, may yield more successful results. Techniques such as geophysical survey may be able to identify candidate locations for the burial pits or the houses around Fawside. It is also possible that widening our horizons beyond the battlefield itself would help to understand Pinkie more. Would archaeological investigations at the Scottish muster point at Fallamoor, or where the English camped at Reston or Linton Bridge as part of the overall campaign, provide us with further information about participants and the management of these large armies? I'm very hopeful that the somewhat limited extent of the finds from Pinkie to date are just the tip of the iceberg, and that there is sufficient potential for archaeology to continue to contribute to the story of the Battle of Pinkie and the people who lived through it. Thank you very much.